19-1. That's not a sports score, that's a kill ratio. For every American Hellcat lost in the Pacific War, 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. In 1942, the Mitsubishi Zero was invincible. By 1945, flying one was suicide. What changed wasn't courage, wasn't skill, wasn't warrior spirit. What changed was mathematics, and mathematics don't care about samurai. This is the story of how an aircraft that looked wrong defeated an aircraft that looked perfect, how 12,275 American fighters destroyed an empire, and how one man with one eye survived long enough to understand why. December 8, 1941. Clark Field, Philippines. 45 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters screamed through the dawn at 18,000 feet, their polished aluminum skin catching fire from the sun behind them. In the lead section, Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, 25 years old, felt his Zero respond to thought before touch, a fraction of pressure on the stick. The aircraft rolled. Another breath of input, it dove. The Americans called it supernatural, the Japanese knew it as engineering perfection. Below, dust rose from the runways. P-40 Warhawks scrambling late, too late. Sakai selected his target, a single P-40 climbing hard, pilot fighting for altitude that would never come. The distance closed, 600 meters, 400, 200. Sakai's finger found the trigger. The Zero's twin 7mm machine guns opened fire. The P-40 shuddered, smoke, then flame, then nothing but a black streak across the sky and a crater in the Philippine jungle. Sakai's first kill. He pulled up through his own gun smoke, the Zero climbing effortlessly, and for a moment he understood what the ancient texts meant about the samurai's sword being an extension of his soul. This aircraft was not a machine, it was wings he had been born without. 2 days later, December 10th, Sakai was among the pilots who engaged a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress piloted by Captain Colin P. Kelly, the first American heavy bomber lost in the Pacific War. Multiple Japanese pilots claimed credit for this kill, and official records never definitively assigned it to any single pilot. He would receive no medal for it. The Japanese Navy did not celebrate individual glory, but his squadron mates would know, the Tainan Kokutai would know, and that was enough. The mathematics of dominance were undeniable. At Pearl Harbor, 29 Japanese aircraft lost, 347 American aircraft destroyed. In the Philippines, 7 losses against 103 destroyed. At Darwin, 2 losses versus 30. Over Ceylon in April 1942, 36 Zeros engaged 60 British aircraft. 27 British planes fell, 1 Zero was lost. The British Far East Fleet's air arm was annihilated. The Dutch East Indies Air Force eliminated in days. Across the Pacific, across Southeast Asia, across every sky where the rising sun flew, the pattern repeated with the mechanical precision of a theorem being proved. At the center of this dominance flew an aircraft that seemed to violate the laws of physics, the Mitsubishi A6M0, range of a bomber, maneuverability of a biplane. Firepower to destroy anything it caught. When captured examples were tested by American engineers in 1942, they initially refused to believe the performance figures. It seemed impossible. The secret was philosophy made metal. Extra super duralumin, a classified aluminum alloy, created a structure 30% lighter than comparable American designs. No armor plate protected the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks added weight. Even the radio was often removed to save 30 pounds, every ounce sacrificed for performance, every constraint eliminated in pursuit of perfection. The result was an aircraft that weighed 5,800 pounds loaded and could turn inside anything the Allies possessed. Wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot gave it a turning radius of 612 feet. In a dogfight, it could fly circles around enemy fighters while they struggled to keep it in sight. But the Zero was only half the equation. The other half was the men who flew it. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, 22 years old, would become Japan's ace of aces with 87 confirmed victories. His squadron mates called him the Devil of Rabaul. American pilots who survived encounters with him used different words: ghost, demon, death. Chief Petty Officer Toshio Ota, 24, already had 19 kills by the spring of 1942. He flew with the precision of a watchmaker and the aggression of a warrior who knew he was invincible. These were not ordinary pilots. The pre-war Imperial Navy pilot training program had been the world's most demanding. 3 years, 700 flight hours before entering combat, aerobatics until the maneuvers became muscle memory. Gunnery until they could hit a target the size of a man's fist from 400 meters. The spiritual philosophy of Bushido until death was not feared but welcomed as the ultimate expression of duty. They were samurai in machines that responded to their will. On May 17, 1942, Sakai, Nishizawa, and Ota decided to demonstrate exactly what that meant. They had just finished attacking Port Moresby. The rest of their squadron had already turned for home, but the three aces looked at each other across the sky and understood the same thought without speaking it. They dove back toward the Allied airfield at 400 miles per hour. Then, at 500 feet directly above enemy anti-aircraft guns, they pulled into a loop, 3 zeros in perfect formation, wingtip to wingtip, describing an arc against the blue New Guinea sky while American and Australian gunners watched from below, too stunned to fire. One loop, then another, then a barrel roll. Then a climbing spiral that defied everything the Allies thought they knew about fighter aircraft performance. The next day, an Allied bomber flew over the Japanese airfield at Leh and dropped a message tied to a wrench. It thanked the Japanese for their wonderful display of aerobatics and informed them that the next time they tried such a stunt, a warm welcome would be waiting. But the message missed the point entirely. The three pilots had not been showing off. They had been delivering a message more fundamental than words. This sky belongs to us. Your aircraft cannot touch us. Your gunners cannot harm us. We own the vertical dimension of this war. For 20 months, that message had been undeniably true. But on June 4, 1942, on a fog-shrouded island in the Aleutians that most maps did not bother to name, something happened that would begin to change everything. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga was 19 years old. He had been flying combat missions since the attack on Dutch Harbor began, and on this morning he was escorting bombers back from their second strike on the American base at Unalaska Island. His wingmen, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsugo Shikada, flew beside him in a loose formation. The mission had been successful, American facilities burning, anti-aircraft fire had been heavy but ineffective. Then Koga's engine began to smoke. Small arms fire from the ground during their strafing run had severed the return oil line, not immediately catastrophic, but fatal over time as the Nakajima Sakai engine slowly starved of lubricant. Koga throttled back, hand signals to his wingmen, engine trouble, making for the emergency landing site at Akutan Island 25 miles east. A submarine waited offshore to retrieve downed pilots. He surveyed Akutan from above, a broad flat grassy plain half a mile inland. Perfect. He dropped his landing gear and lined up for approach. At the last moment his wingman Shikada saw it, a glint of moisture reflecting from the grass, not a grassy plain, a marsh. But the warning came too late. Koga's Zero touched down at 90 miles per hour. The wheels sank into soft ground. The aircraft pitched forward. The propeller struck earth and the Zero flipped onto its back in a shower of mud and torn grass. Inside the inverted cockpit, Koga's neck snapped. Death was instant. Endo and Shikada circled above, watching for movement. Japanese fighter pilots had been ordered to destroy any Zero that made an emergency landing in Allied-held territory. The aircraft contained too many secrets. But Koga was their friend, their squadron mate. They believed he might have survived. They chose not to strafe his aircraft. They chose to let him live, they thought. Instead, they had just given the United States the key to defeating the Zero. On July 10, 1942, a US Navy patrol spotted the aircraft during a search of Akutan Island. Nearly intact, upside down in the marsh like a gift waiting to be opened. The recovery operation took days, barge, winches, careful extraction from the mud. By July 15th, the Zero was crated and loaded onto a transport. By August, it was in San Diego. By September, it was flying again. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Trapnell, the Navy's chief test pilot, flew the captured Zero against every American fighter in service. Same altitude, same speed, same maneuvers, perfect controlled comparison. The results were devastating. In a turning fight, the Zero could indeed fly circles around American aircraft, but it had weaknesses. The ailerons froze at high speed, making the aircraft sluggish in rolls above 300 miles per hour. The engine cut out in negative G maneuvers due to a faulty carburetor. The lightweight construction that gave it such maneuverability made it fragile. A handful of 50 caliber hits could tear it apart. Most importantly, the tests revealed that American fighters did not need to turn with the Zero. They needed to never turn with it. High-speed slashing attacks. Dive, shoot, climb away. use weight as a weapon instead of fighting it as a handicap. Lieutenant Melvin Hoffman was checked out in the captured Zero and began flying mock combat against trainees. American pilots learned to fight the Zero by fighting the real thing in training. They learned its blind spots, its limitations, its fatal weaknesses. But the captured Zero did not influence the design of the fighter that would ultimately defeat it. That fighter was already flying. On June 30th, 1941, 3 days before the discovery of Koga's Zero, Grumman Aircraft had signed a contract for the F6F. On May 23, 1942, 2 weeks before Koga's crash, the production order for the F6F had been placed. The first production Hellcat flew in October 1942, just weeks after the captured Zero arrived in the United States. The timeline made a myth impossible. The Hellcat was not designed from captured Zero data, but it would be perfected using that data. Meanwhile, 5,000 miles away in the Pacific, Saburo Sakai was about to learn the first law of aerial combat. Dominance is always temporary. On August 3, 1942, the Tainan Air Group relocated from Lae to Rabaul. 4 days later, word arrived that US Marines had landed on Guadalcanal. They had captured an airfield under construction by Japanese forces, Henderson Field. For the next 6 months, that airfield would become the focus of the most intense air campaign of the Pacific War. Every day, Japanese bombers would try to destroy it. Every day, Hellcat and Wildcat fighters from Henderson Field would try to stop them. Every day, the Tainan Kokutai would escort the bombers and engage the defenders. On August 8, 1942, Saburo Sakai took off on what should have been another routine mission. He would never fly another routine mission again. The engagement developed over Guadalcanal at 18,000 feet, Wildcats rising from Henderson Field, Zeros diving to intercept, the familiar dance of thrust and counter-thrust. Sakai spotted what he thought was a formation of 8 Wildcat fighters. He dove on them from above and behind, the classic killing position. They were not Wildcats. They were Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and unlike fighters, they carried rear-facing gunners. Sakai committed to his attack before he understood his mistake. At 200 meters, 8 .30 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The concentrated fire was a wall of metal he flew directly into. A single bullet struck his head just above the right eye. His skull penetrated, his right eye instantly blind, the left side of his body paralyzed. Blood filled his remaining good eye. The Zero rolled inverted and entered a dive toward the ocean 18,000 feet below. Most men would have died. Sakai, through tears and blood and the screaming pain of a bullet in his brain, pulled the stick back. The Zero groaned, protested, then responded. He leveled out at 5,000 feet, half blind, half paralyzed, knowing that if he lost consciousness for even a moment, he would die. The distance to Rabaul was 560 nautical miles, 4 hours and 47 minutes of flight time. He had perhaps 30 minutes of fuel remaining if he used a lean mixture. Perhaps. Sakai made a decision that would become legendary. He would fly the entire distance inverted. Upside down, the blood would not pool in his remaining good eye. Upside down, he could see just enough through the tears and blood to navigate by the volcanic peaks he had memorized. Upside down, he could survive. For 4 hours and 47 minutes, Saburo Sakai flew a Mitsubishi Zero at 8,000 feet inverted, with a bullet in his brain and one eye blind, navigating by landmarks and instrument and pure samurai will. When Rabaul appeared on the horizon, he rolled the aircraft upright, circled the airfield 4 times while his vision cleared, and landed on his second attempt with the fuel gauge reading empty. He taxied to the parking area, shut down the engine, then insisted on climbing out and walking to the operations tent to file his mission report before he would accept medical treatment. He dictated his report, described the engagement, estimated enemy casualties, provided tactical observations. Then he collapsed. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa drove him to the surgeon at speeds that terrified even combat pilots. On August 12, 1942, Sakai was evacuated to Japan. The surgery that followed was performed without anesthesia. Japan was running low on medical supplies. He would remember every second of it. The surgeons repaired some of the damage to his skull, but they could not restore sight to his right eye. In January 1943, Saburo Sakai was discharged from the hospital with one eye blind. His combat days, he believed, were over. He was 26 years old. He had over 60 victories in combat, though official Japanese records would credit him with 28. He was one of the finest fighter pilots in the world, and his war, he believed, was over. 3,000 miles to the east, another fighter pilot was just beginning his. David McCampbell was 33 years old in September 1943. In a profession where most fighter pilots were barely old enough to vote, he was ancient. He should have been flying a desk. Instead, he had just been given command of Fighting Squadron 15. VF-15 would fly the F6F Hellcat, an aircraft that violated every principle the Japanese had perfected. It weighed 12,186 pounds fully loaded, twice the Zero's weight. Its wing area spanned 334 square feet with a massive radial engine that looked like it belonged on a bomber. It carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition, armor plate everywhere, bulletproof glass, self-sealing tanks holding 250 gallons of fuel. It was heavy, draggy, seemingly clumsy. Japanese intelligence officers who received the first specifications through neutral Swedish sources in early 1943 laughed at it. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned Pearl Harbor, dismissed it as another American failure of design. Attempting to overcome pilot skill with weight of machinery, the mathematics seemed to support his assessment. The Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot gave it that impossible 612-foot turning radius. The Hellcat's wing loading of 36, 5 pounds per square foot, suggested a turning radius over 900 feet. In a turning fight, the Hellcat would be helpless. But David McCampbell had no intention of turning with anyone. He had studied the reports from the captured Zero. He had listened to the pilots who had survived encounters with it. He had learned what the Japanese seemed unable to comprehend. This was not a war of individual samurai dueling in the sky. This was industrial combat. And the Hellcat was not designed to be a better Zero. It was designed to make the Zero irrelevant. On September 1st, 1943, while Saburo Sakai was in Japan training pilots who would never be as skilled as he had been, while Japanese intelligence officers were laughing at specifications they did not understand, while the myth of Zero invincibility still held sway across the Pacific, the F6F Hellcat entered combat. 30 days later, the systematic annihilation of Japanese naval aviation would begin. The rising sun was at zenith. The long fall was about to start. And neither side yet understood that the mathematics of aerial supremacy were about to be rewritten by an aircraft that looked wrong, flew heavy, and seemed to violate every principle the Japanese had perfected. The question was not whether the Hellcat could defeat the Zero. The question was whether anyone flying a Zero would survive long enough to understand why they had lost. January 1943. Yokosuka Naval Air Station, Japan. Saburo Sakai stood before a classroom of 30 young men who would soon be dead. He knew this with the certainty of mathematics. These student pilots, fresh from abbreviated training, outranked him now, ensigns and junior lieutenants while he remained a petty officer. They sat with the confidence of men who had never seen combat, who had never watched a wingman die, who believed the propaganda about Japanese invincibility because they had never encountered the truth. They had 300 hours of flight time. Sakai had entered combat with 700. They had fired perhaps 50 practice rounds. Sakai had fired thousands. They knew aerobatics from textbooks. Sakai knew them from survival. The Americans have changed, Sakai told them, his one good eye scanning the classroom. Forget what you learned about dogfighting. They will not dogfight you. A young ensign raised his hand. 20 years old, probably never been in an aircraft that was actually shooting at him. Sensei, if they will not fight, how can they win? Sakai was silent for a long moment. How do you explain to children that there are different kinds of fighting? That refusing battle when disadvantaged is not cowardice but intelligence. That the warrior code they had been taught was beautiful and spiritual and would get them killed in the sky over the Pacific. They fight, Sakai said quietly. They simply refused to fight our fight. The ensign looked confused. The others looked skeptical. They did not believe him because they had not yet seen what he had seen. They would learn. Briefly, across the Pacific, the new generation was already learning. September 30th, 1943, Marcus Island. Lieutenant Tadashi Nakajima was 31 years old, an experienced pilot with multiple victories and the burden of command. He led the 204th Air Group's fighter squadron, 18 Zeros, good pilots, not great, not anymore. The great ones were dead or wounded or training children back in Japan. He saw them first. 6 dark shapes climbing from the southeast at 15,000 feet, Large, single-engine, unfamiliar silhouette, unidentified aircraft, he reported over the radio. Investigate and engage. The Zeros turned toward the unknown contacts. As the distance closed, Nakajima could make out the details. Stubby wings, massive fuselage. It looked like someone had tried to build a fighter out of a torpedo bomber, the Americans' new Hellcat. Nakajima felt a moment of disappointment. Intelligence reports had described this aircraft as heavy and ungainly. This would not be a challenge. This would be practice for his younger pilots. He led his formation into a diving attack, the standard Zero tactic that had worked for 3 years. Dive from above, use superior turning ability to get on the enemy's 6. Short burst of fire. Victory. The Hellcats did not run. They did not scatter. They went vertical. Nakajima watched in disbelief as 6 aircraft that should have been helpless against Zeros climbed at an angle that seemed to defy physics. His own Zero, trying to follow, felt like it was climbing through honey, airspeed bleeding, engine gasping for air that was not there. At 20,000 feet, the Hellcats reached what should have been impossible altitude for their weight. Then they performed maneuvers that Nakajima's mind struggled to process, a vertical reversal, a hammerhead turn. Combat techniques that required power no American fighter should possess. One Hellcat dropped onto a Zero's tail before the Japanese pilot understood what was happening. 6 machine guns opened fire. Not the 4 guns intelligence had reported. 6 Browning 50 calibers firing 4,500 rounds per minute of heavy metal that could tear an aircraft apart. The Zero disintegrated, literally came apart in mid-air. Pieces of wing, sections of fuselage, a man tumbling without a parachute because Japanese pilots rarely wore them. Weight savings, another Zero tried the classic escape. Dive away and use superior maneuverability at low altitude. The Hellcat followed in the dive and kept pace and closed distance. At 8,000 feet the Hellcat was still gaining. A second Zero exploded. Nakajima called the retreat. His remaining pilots scattered. The Hellcats did not pursue. They climbed back to altitude and resumed their patrol as if nothing had happened. 2 Zeros destroyed. 0 Hellcats lost. That night Nakajima wrote in his diary. The words came slowly. We have been fighting with tactics developed against the Wildcat. The Hellcat is not a Wildcat. It does not play by rules we understand. It refuses to turn. It climbs like a rocket, it dives like a meteor, and when it shoots, our aircraft cease to exist. I do not know how to defeat this machine. October 5th, 1943. Wake Island. 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group climbed to intercept an American carrier raid. The formation leader was Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, 29 years old, 11 victories. A solid pilot, not elite, but experienced enough to know when something was wrong. Below them at 18,000 feet, 12 Hellcats flew in perfect 4-plane divisions. The Japanese held every advantage: altitude, position, sun at their backs, surprise. Shiga led the attack, standard dive. High-speed approach, open fire at maximum range. The Hellcats did not evade, they maintained formation, absorbed the fire, kept flying. Shiga's bullets hit one Hellcat at least a dozen times. He saw the impacts, sparks along the wing, holes punched in the fuselage. The aircraft shuddered but maintained position in the formation like a wounded man who refuses to fall. His ammunition exhausted, Shiga pulled up and climbed for altitude to set up another pass. Standard Zero doctrine, hit and run. Use superior climb rate to regain advantage. The Hellcat he had shot simply followed him up. This was impossible. A damaged aircraft, a heavy fighter. It should have been losing altitude, seeking to escape. Instead, it climbed with him. Matched his rate of climb, then exceeded it. At 25,000 feet, Shiga's engine was producing perhaps 900 horsepower in the thin air. The Hellcat was still producing over 1,600. The American came down on him like a hawk on a sparrow. Shiga saw the muzzle flashes, felt the impacts. The Zero's lightweight construction that had been its greatest strength became its fatal weakness. No armor to stop the bullets, no self-sealing tanks to contain the fire. His fuel tanks erupted. The Zero became a comet, falling, burning. Shiga managed to bail out at 15,000 feet. He would survive to be rescued by a Japanese submarine. 7 of his pilots would not. By sunset, 8 Zeros had been destroyed over Wake Island. 0 Hellcats were lost. Not damaged. Lost. The mathematics had inverted. November 11th, 1943. Rabaul. The assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group sat in uncomfortable silence as Lieutenant Nakajima briefed them on American tactics. He had survived 3 encounters with Hellcats now. He was beginning to understand, beginning to fear. "Forget everything you know about air combat," Nakajima said. His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes that the younger pilots had never seen before. Doubt. "The Americans have changed the rules. They no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners." He drew a diagram on the chalkboard. 2 Hellcats in vertical formation. One high, one low. They work in pairs. Perfect coordination. While you engage the low fighter, the high one is already diving on you. Their radios give them perfect communication. "We fly as individual samurai. They fight as a machine." An ensign raised his hand. 22 years old. 200 hours total flight time. "Sensei, if we cannot turn with them, and we cannot climb with them, and we cannot run from them, how do we fight them?" Nakajima looked at the young pilot for a long moment. The honest answer was, "You don't, you die." But he could not say that, not yet. "You survive," Nakajima said quietly. "You survive long enough to learn, and you never, ever fight alone." December 1943, Truk Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, 41 years old, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, walked among the damaged Zeros returning from patrol. His job now was not to fly, but to analyze, to understand, to find a way to turn the tide that was clearly turning against them. He stopped at one Zero that had returned with 17 bullet holes. The pilot, barely alive, had described his encounter with a Hellcat. Fuchida examined the damage pattern and felt his stomach turn. The bullets had gone completely through the aircraft, entry holes on one side, exit holes on the other. The 50 caliber rounds carried so much energy that they simply punched through aluminum and kept going. If they hit something vital, the aircraft died. If they hit the pilot, there was no wounded. Only dead. He examined another Zero with its fuel tanks punctured. Fuel still leaking. No fire, only because the pilot had shut off the pumps immediately. An American aircraft with self-sealing tanks would have automatically sealed these holes, would have kept flying. A Zero with holes in the fuel tanks was a Zero that would burn. Fuchida made notes. The technological gap was widening. The technological disparity was mathematical. The Hellcat's 650 caliber guns delivered 6 times the striking power of the Zero's armament. Combined with 212 pounds of pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, the American fighter could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero instantly. The Zero had none of this. Every ounce saved for performance. Every protection sacrificed for maneuverability. In 1941, that philosophy had made them invincible. In 1943, it was making them dead. But the technological gap was only part of the story. The larger problem was something Fuchida was only beginning to understand. A young pilot approached him. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi, 25 years old, 6 victories. He looked shaken. "Commander, I must report something. We were climbing through clouds when they hit us. No warning, no visual contact. The Hellcats dove from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned." Fuchida frowned. "You were spotted?" "Impossible, sir. We were inside the clouds. They could not have seen us." "Then how?" Kamachi hesitated. "They knew where we were. Our altitude, our course, our speed." "We were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark. Radar-guided fighter direction. American carriers had shipboard radar that could detect aircraft from 50 miles away. Controllers could vector their fighters to perfect intercept positions. The Japanese fighters were still relying on human eyesight. By the time they saw the enemy had already positioned for the kill. It was not combat anymore, it was systematic extermination. January 1944, the pilot crisis became catastrophic. Pre-war Japanese naval pilots had trained for 3 years, 700 flight hours, aerobatics until perfect, gunnery until automatic, formation flying until they could hold position in their sleep. By January 1944, training had been cut to 300 hours for naval pilots, 200 for army pilots. Most training was done in gliders because fuel was needed at the front. Gunnery practice was limited to 50 rounds per pilot total. Formation flying, instrument flight, radio procedures. All eliminated to rush pilots to combat. Meanwhile, American pilots were arriving with 300 hours minimum, including 50 hours in type. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, practiced carrier landings until automatic. Learned energy tactics in safety over Texas airfields. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, 38 years old, training officer at Kazumigara Naval Air Station, wrote in his final report a sentence that would haunt him until his death. "We are sending children to fight professionals," he described one pilot. Ensign Yamamoto, 19 years old, arrived at the front line having never fired his guns in flight, never flown at night, never practiced radio communication under stress. He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. 7 minutes. Then he was simply gone. No parachute, no wreckage found, just gone. Deleted from existence by a system he never understood, flying an aircraft he barely knew how to control, fighting an enemy that was not fighting but executing. October 12, 1944. The Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi, 57 years old, commander of the 2nd Air Fleet, committed everything to stop the American carrier raids, over 700 aircraft, including the last trained pilots from the homeland training squadrons. It was desperation disguised as strategy. The Japanese pilots, launched in waves, found the American carriers, pressed their attacks with the courage that had always defined them, and died in numbers that defied comprehension. The Japanese claimed spectacular victory. 26 American carriers and battleships sunk, 300 aircraft destroyed. Fukudomi's staff prepared victory announcements, medals were discussed, promotions planned, then the pilots returned, and the gun camera footage was developed. The truth was worse than defeat, it was annihilation. Actual American losses: 89 aircraft, no carriers, no battleships. Japanese losses: 329 aircraft, almost every experienced pilot, men who had survived dozens of missions, who had trained the next generation, who represented the institutional knowledge of 3 years of brutal air combat, gone in 3 days. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, 27 years old, one of the few survivors, described it in his memoirs years later. His words were simple, devastating. The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. As we climbed, they were above us. As we dove, they were below. They had divided the sky into grids, each section covered by a division. It was not combat, it was systematic extermination. We were not fighting pilots, we were fighting a machine that thought in 3 dimensions and operated with perfect coordination. By the second day we knew we were dead. We flew anyway, because that was our duty, but we knew. The psychological impact of Formosa broke something fundamental in the Japanese pilot corps. They stopped believing in victory, stopped believing in their training, stopped believing in the zero. They still flew, still fought, still died, but they no longer believed they could win. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, 58 years old, launched Operation Ago with the confidence of a man who did not yet understand that the war had already been lost. 9 Japanese carriers, 450 aircraft, against Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, 15 American carriers, 956 aircraft, 450 of them were F6F Hellcats. Ozawa believed in the decisive battle, the Kantai Kessen, one climactic engagement that would destroy American carrier power and turn the tide of the war. He launched his first wave at 0830. 69 aircraft, fighters and bombers in formation, professional execution, perfect navigation. American radar detected them at 150 miles. By the time the Japanese formations reached their targets, the Hellcats were already positioned. 20,000 to 30,000 feet, altitude advantage, sun at their backs, approaching from the Japanese blind spots. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from the USS Essex, saw them coming. His voice over the radio was calm, professional, a man doing his job. Engage at will. Standard tactics: make your runs count. The Japanese formation never had a chance. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. 42 of the 69 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The remaining 27 scattered and ran. Many would not make it back to their carriers. McCampbell personally shot down 7 aircraft that day, 5 Yokosuka D-4 Judy dive bombers in his first encounter. Then a second mission later that afternoon where he downed 2 Zeros over Guam. His wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, got 6. Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu shot down 6 Judys in 8 minutes. After landing, he held up 6 fingers to the cameras. The photograph would become iconic, but the numbers told the real story. By day's end, the Japanese had launched 4 waves. 396 aircraft total, 346 carrier aircraft were destroyed, 50 land-based aircraft were destroyed. American losses from all causes, 30 aircraft. 30. American pilots in their ready rooms that evening coined the term that would define the battle. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The enemy aircraft had been as helpless as game birds. Vice Admiral Ozawa would write in his after-action report a sentence that captured the totality of the defeat. The enemy's radar-guided fighter direction achieved something we thought impossible: the industrialization of air combat. Each Hellcat was not an individual fighter but a component in a vast machine. Our pilots, no matter how skilled, were engaging not planes but a system they could not defeat, could not understand, could not survive. April 1944. While the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was still weeks away, while Japanese naval aviation was preparing for the decisive battle that would destroy them, Saburo Sakai was transferred to Yokosuka Air Wing. He was 27 years old now, still flying with one eye. The Navy had promoted him to warrant officer in November 1943, not because he had proven himself in combat recently. Because they were desperate, because they needed every experienced pilot who could still climb into a cockpit. Yokosuka Air Wing was deployed to Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island halfway between Japan and the Mariana Islands, strategic, vital, and directly in the path of the American advance. Sakai requested permission to return to combat. His superiors hesitated. A partially blind pilot, an aging ace better used for training. But Sakai pressed, and finally they relented. On April 15, 1944, Saburo Sakai flew his first combat mission in 20 months. He climbed into a Zero that felt different, smaller somehow, more fragile, or perhaps it was him that had changed. The mission was routine patrol, no contact. He returned safely. But he knew something had changed in the war. His fellow pilots, the young ones with barely 200 hours, spoke about the Americans with a fear that would have been unthinkable in 1942. They talked about the Hellcat like it was supernatural, invincible. Sakai tried to tell them it was just a machine, just an aircraft, but he had not yet encountered one himself. Had not yet tested his skill against the new American fighter. That test was coming, and when it came, Saburo Sakai, the samurai ace with over 60 victories and over 200 combats, would learn the hardest lesson of all. The Zero had ruled the Pacific sky for 3 years. The Hellcat was about to make the Zero pilots understand what it felt like to be prey. And time was running out for the men who still believed that warrior spirit could defeat industrial mathematics. The mathematics were merciless, and the mathematics said they were already dead. June 24, 1944, Iwo Jima. Saburo Sakai was at 18,000 feet when he saw them. 15 aircraft in formation approaching from the east. The silhouette was familiar. The distinctive shape of Japanese fighters returning from patrol. He turned toward them to join formation. It was only as the distance closed to 2 miles that something felt wrong. The way they flew, the formation spacing, the angle of approach. These were not Japanese fighters, these were Grumman F6F Hellcats. And Sakai had just flown directly into the middle of 15 enemy aircraft who believed he was attacking them. The realization came with the sick clarity of a man who has just made a fatal mistake. He was alone, 1-0, one eye, against 15 Hellcats that were now breaking formation and turning toward him like a pack of wolves that had just spotted prey. What happened next would become legendary, not because Sakai won, but because he survived. Over 60 victories, over 200 combats, 3 years of experience fighting in China, the Philippines, New Guinea, and Guadalcanal. Every aerobatic maneuver perfected until it was muscle memory, every combat trick learned through survival, every lesson written in the blood of dead wingmen. Sakai threw his Zero into a vertical rolling scissors. The Hellcats followed. He snapped into a high G barrel roll. They followed. He performed a split S that pulled 6 Gs and should have torn his aircraft apart. They followed. For 20 minutes, Saburo Sakai flew combat against 15 Hellcats with one eye, and the absolute certainty that any mistake would be his last. He could not shoot, could not run, could only evade, only survive, only demonstrate the gap between what he had been and what the war had become. The Hellcats followed him through every maneuver, easily, almost casually. Like instructors chasing a student who was performing well but could never quite escape. One Hellcat pilot made a mistake, forgot to release his drop tank before entering combat. The extra weight and drag gave Sakai the fraction of advantage he needed. He extended the distance, dove for the deck, used every feature of the volcanic island terrain to break visual contact. He landed at Iwo Jima with his fuel gauge reading empty and the knowledge that had fundamentally changed him. Years later, he would write in his autobiography the words that captured the moment completely. I performed my best aerobatics, loops, rolls, splits, scissors, every maneuver I had perfected over 200 combats. The Hellcats followed easily, almost casually. I survived only because one American pilot made an error. Not because of my skill, because of his mistake. I understood then what I had refused to believe. Individual excellence cannot defeat organized industrial power, no matter how perfect the technique, no matter how pure the spirit. Saburo Sakai had just learned that lesson at 18,000 feet over Iwo Jima, and he had survived to tell it. Most Japanese pilots were not so fortunate. October 24, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Commander David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15, flying an F6F Hellcat he had named Mincy 3 after his hometown in Pennsylvania. He was leading 7 Hellcats from the USS Essex on a routine combat air patrol when the call came through. Large enemy formation inbound, bearing 270, altitude mixed, estimate 60+ aircraft. McCampbell's response was calm, mathematical, the voice of a man who had already shot down 25 enemy aircraft and knew exactly what he was going to do next. Roger. Engaging. 7 Hellcats turned towards 60 Japanese aircraft. The odds were insane. 8-1. In any previous war, in any previous aerial combat, 7 fighters encountering 60 would have run, would have called for help, would have done anything except deliberately flying toward the larger formation. But this was not 1942. This was not the war where numbers determined outcomes. McCampbell positioned his division for the attack. High sun, altitude advantage, perfect deflection angle. Then he gave the order that would make military history. Section attack. Make your shots count. We're going to kill them all. For 90 minutes, 7 F6F Hellcats systematically destroyed a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell fired until his guns ran dry. 9 aircraft destroyed. 5 Zeros, 4 bombers. Each engagement was textbook. High side run, lead the target, short controlled burst, aircraft disintegrates, zoom climb back to altitude, select next target, repeat. His wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, got 6 more. The remaining Hellcats accounted for the rest until 15 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed without a single American loss. The surviving Japanese formation scattered and fled. When McCampbell finally landed aboard the USS Langley, the Essex's deck was not clear. His 650 caliber machine guns had exactly 2 rounds of ammunition remaining between them, and his aircraft had to be manually released from the arrestor wire because it was completely out of fuel. Maintainers had to physically push the Hellcat off the landing area. The tanks were dry, the guns were empty, the pilot was exhausted, but 15 enemy aircraft were gone, and 7 Hellcats had survived. McCampbell had just become the only American pilot to achieve ace in a day status twice. 7 kills on June 19th during the Marianas Turkey Shoot, 9 kills on October 24th at Leyte Gulf. No other American pilot would ever match that record. For this action, for his leadership of Air Group 15, for his 34 total victories, David McCampbell would receive the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. But more than individual glory, his achievement demonstrated the complete reversal of air superiority that had occurred in just 2 years. In 1942, 7 Zeros encountering 60 American aircraft would have won. In 1944, 7 Hellcats encountering 60 Japanese aircraft was simply another day at the office. The mathematics had inverted completely, and the human cost of that inversion was staggering. October 25th, 1944. Philippines. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, 24 years old, 87 confirmed victories. Japan's ace of aces, the Devil of Rabaul, escorted the first official kamikaze mission led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. The concept of kamikaze would have been unthinkable in 1942. Suicidal attacks were the tactic of the desperate, the defeated. But by October 1944, Japan had run out of options. Conventional attacks against American carriers had become suicide missions anyway. At least as a kamikaze, the pilot's death had mathematical certainty of meaning. Nishizawa flew escort, protected the suicide bombers. In the chaos of combat, he reportedly claimed his 86th and 87th victories, his final combat mission before being ordered home. The next day, October 26th, Nishizawa was ordered to return to Japan for a new assignment, training duty again. The Navy needed experienced instructors more than it needed combat pilots. Even their greatest ace, he boarded a transport aircraft, a Nakajima Ki-49 bomber converted for cargo and passenger service, unarmed, ungainly, slow. At 13,000 feet over Mindoro, the transport was intercepted by 4 F6F Hellcats from VF-14. The Hellcats did not know who was aboard. Did not know that Japan's greatest ace was riding as a passenger. It did not matter. An enemy aircraft was an enemy aircraft. The transport had no chance, no armor, no defensive armament, no speed to escape. The Hellcats made one pass. That was all it took. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, 87 victories, the pilot who had performed loops in formation over Allied airfields to mock them, who had survived 3 years of brutal combat, who was regarded as perhaps the finest natural pilot Japan had ever produced, died as a passenger in a transport that could not fight back. Shot down by the very aircraft he had spent the last year learning to fear. The symbolism was perfect and terrible. The greatest samurai in Japan, helpless without his sword. Killed by a machine he could not defeat even when he was flying his Zero. Absolutely helpless as a passenger. When news of Nishizawa's death reached the remaining pilots, something broke. If the Devil of Rabaul could be killed so casually, so pointlessly, what chance did the rest of them have? The psychological collapse was complete. By November 1944, the transformation of Japanese naval aviation from an elite force to a kamikaze operation represented the ultimate admission of Hellcat superiority. Unable to compete conventionally, unable to protect even their greatest ace, Japan turned its pilots into guided missiles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the kamikaze program, justified it with mathematics that was stark and honest. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, probability of success is near zero. The Hellcats will destroy it. If the Zero becomes a bomb, probability of hitting increases to 30%. The pilot dies either way. At least as a kamikaze, his death has meaning. The logic was flawless and monstrous. Training for kamikaze pilots was reduced to 40 to 50 hours total. Approximately 7 days from civilian to suicide bomber, they learned to take off, to fly straight, to recognize a carrier, to dive. They did not learn to land. There was no point. By war's end, the statistics told a story that transcended individual battles and became a chronicle of systematic destruction. The F6F Hellcat destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. Lost 270 aircraft to enemy fighters. The kill ratio was 19, 3 to 1 overall, against Zero's specifically approximately 13 to 1, 305 US. Navy pilots achieved ace status flying the Hellcat. The aircraft accounted for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories in the Pacific. Grumman produced 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. At peak production, a new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every 60 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Japan produced approximately 6,000 Zeros from 1943 to 1945. The Japanese Navy had started the war with 18,000 trained naval aviators. By August 1945, fewer than 100 combat-capable pilots remained. The rest were dead. Or so inexperienced they might as well have been. The numbers were not just statistics, they were epitaphs. Each number represented a name, a face. A family that received a letter explaining that their son had died bravely in service to the emperor. Most families did not receive bodies. Most pilots simply disappeared, shot down over the ocean. Incinerated in mid-air, deleted from existence so completely that there was nothing to bury except memory and grief. August 15, 1945, at Tsugi Airfield, Japan. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had dismissed the Hellcat as a failure of American design, who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had believed that Japanese pilot skill would always overcome American industrial weight, stood on the runway and listened to Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. Around him sat the remnants of Japanese naval aviation, teenage pilots with 40 hours of flight time, aircraft cobbled together from spare parts, empty fuel tanks, no ammunition. That same day, Ensign Clarence Moore of VF-31, flying from the USS Belleau Wood, shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber after 2 p.m., the last aerial victory of World War II. The Japanese pilot apparently had not received word of the surrender, or had received it and chosen to ignore it. Either way, he approached the American fleet and Ensign Moore intercepted him. 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns ended the Pacific Air War. September 1945, at Tsugi Airfield, the first American aircraft to land after the surrender were 12 F6F Hellcats from the USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics and ground crew lined the runway to see their tormentor up close. The Hellcats taxied into formation, engines shut down, canopies opened, American pilots climbed out. Lieutenant Robert Vasa, 26 years old, 19 victories, was asked by a Japanese interpreter if he would demonstrate the Hellcat's capabilities. Vasa climbed back into his aircraft, started the engine, taxied to the far end of the runway, then performed a display of aerobatics that left the Japanese observers speechless, loops at airspeeds that would have torn the Zero apart, rolls at G-forces that would have broken Japanese aircraft, climbs at angles that seemed to violate physics, and through it all, casual precision, a pilot barely pushing his aircraft to half its capability. After landing, Vasa spoke through an interpreter to a group of Japanese pilots. "You have to understand, this isn't even pushing it. In combat, with water injection, it's 20% more powerful. The plane is stressed for 13 Gs. I've never managed to break one, no matter what I do to it." The Japanese pilots were silent, processing, understanding finally what they had been fighting. Not just an aircraft, an entire philosophy of warfare, an industrial civilization that could afford to build fighters strong enough to absorb punishment, powerful enough to ignore the enemy's strength, numerous enough to make individual skill irrelevant. Saburo Sakai was not at Atsugi that day, but he would live until the year 2000, 55 years after the war ended. Long enough to see Japan rebuilt, long enough to see former enemies become friends, long enough to reflect on what it all meant. In his final interview, a reporter asked him about the Hellcat. Sakai was 83 years old, one eye still blind, but his mind was sharp and his memory perfect. He thought for a long moment before answering. The Zero made Japan a great naval power. The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were just men with outdated weapons facing the future. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live. That is the ultimate defeat, existing at your enemy's discretion. He paused, looking at something only he could see, memories of young men who never got old, of a sky that had once belonged to Japan, and then belonged to no one, and then belonged to America, of a war that was decided not by courage or skill or warrior spirit, but by factories and resources and the cold mathematics of industrial production. "I pray every day for the souls of my enemies as well as my comrades," Sakai said. "We all did our best for our respective countries. The Americans simply had superior industrial capacity and training infrastructure." Professor Jiro Horikoshi, who had designed the Zero, studied captured Hellcats extensively after the war. His conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. "We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age." The F6F Hellcat represented an entirely different approach to fighter design, one that prioritized pilot survival, firepower, and mass production over pure maneuverability. Japanese pilots had laughed at it in September 1943 because they did not understand that every extra pound represented not weakness but the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors. By the time they understood, their laughter had turned to last letters home, their mockery to kamikaze missions, their confidence to complete collapse. The Hellcat had not just defeated the Zero. It had destroyed an entire philosophy of warfare, proving that, in modern combat, the nation that could build the better system would destroy the nation that could only build better warriors. Individual excellence, warrior spirit, Bushido, honor, courage, sacrifice, these things mattered, these things were real, these things defined the men who flew, but they were not enough, they had never been enough. The mathematics were merciless. The factories ran 24 hours a day. The training pipeline produced pilots faster than combat could kill them. The radar saw everything. The radios coordinated perfectly. The system operated with machine efficiency, and against a system, individual samurai could only die with honor, which they did, by the thousands. The Japanese pilots who laughed at the F6F Hellcat in 1943 were almost all dead by 1945, shot down, burned alive, exploded in mid-air, or deliberately crashed into American ships in the final desperate mathematics of kamikaze. The Hellcat pilots who killed them went home to America, got married, had children, grew old. Some became businessmen. Some became teachers. Some never spoke about the war. David McCampbell retired from the Navy in 1964 as a captain, lived until 1996, never bragged about his 34 victories. just did his job and came home. Saburo Sakai became a Buddhist acolyte after the war, vowed he would never kill another living thing, not even a mosquito. Spent the rest of his life praying for the souls of the men he had killed and the men who had tried to kill him. The Hellcat had the last laugh. It always did, not because it was flown by better men, but because industrial capacity ultimately determined the outcome. The samurai discovered that truth at 20,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean. Some of them survived long enough to teach it to the next generation. Most did not. The sky remembers them all.